My name is Blakeslee. I've written a book called American Wolf, a true story of survival and obsession in the West. Before I start, I want to say thanks so much to all of you for coming to listen, and to our hosts for the invitation, and to say what an honor it is to share the stage with someone like y'all and our fellow writers. It's one of the great things about being on a book tour is all the great people you get to meet and interact with. In December of 2012, a wolf was killed in a valley just east of Yellowstone National Park. She was arguably the world's most famous wild animal. Her name was 06, nicknamed for the year in which she was born. And she was a fourth-generation descendant of wolves that were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in the mid-90s after having been gone from the park and the northern Rockies and much of the continental United States for over 80 years. She was shot legally during the first wolf hunt held in the state of Wyoming in over 80 years. It was the culmination of a decades-long political fight that had been going on over how wolves ought to be managed in the West. 06 became famous because she was by far the easiest to spot wolf in Yellowstone. And she had come of age sort of during a time when wolf watching had become this big phenomenon in Yellowstone, and during a time when Facebook was exploding. So thousands of people had seen her rear her pups, had watched her hunt elk, had watched her battle rival packs, and her story had become this phenomenon that had spread around the world. And so when she was shot, the backlash against it was enormous. And I read about this story in the New York Times, along with millions of other people, the day after she was shot, and the story went around the world. And I decided I wanted to write about that story. I live in Austin, Texas. I write about politics and policy. My previous book had been about the drug war in Texas, a drug war scandal in a town called Tulia. And so perfect match, a writer and subject, a wolf that died 1,500 miles away from Texas. But it actually was something close to my heart because I used to go and visit that part of the world in the summers. Every summer that I was in college, my friends and I would leave Texas and go up to Wyoming, which has this enormous tourist business in the summer, you probably know, and we would get jobs, usually in Jackson, which is just south of Yellowstone. And I know that you all are not guidance counselors, but it was probably the most wonderful part of my college career was doing this in the summer. So I highly recommend it to all of your first-year fresh persons who are coming in. And they should take this book with them when they go. So it meant a lot to me. But when I was there in the early 90s, there were no wolves there. And so what looked like a paradise to me, and Yellowstone is a paradise, it's an amazingly unique place. It is not just the park, but the wilderness that surrounds it is the largest essentially intact temperate ecosystem left in the world. It is truly a marvel and the jewel of our national park system. But it was also a profoundly broken ecosystem. And I didn't realize that in the early 90s, and I imagine most people that went to Yellowstone at that time didn't realize it either, because it had been broken for so long that it seemed normal to us. And what was missing was wolves, the apex predator that sort of shaped and kept that habitat, that landscape, that ecosystem functional had been gone for 80 years. And what you saw in Yellowstone as a result was this massive explosion in the elk population. Elk were overrunning the park, they were destroying the habitat, they were ruining rivers. So much so to the extent that even by the 1940s, park rangers realized they had to intervene, they had to do something. And so what they would do is, in the winter, they would round up thousands of elk and they would shoot them. Usually when there were no visitors around, so no one could see. It became like the dirty secret of Yellowstone. They essentially replaced wolves with bullets. And the idea that wolves would be sort of a more holistic solution to that problem arose as early as the 1950s, but it was controversial because ranchers, the same ranchers that hunted those wolves out of those mountains generations ago, they're all still there. Their descendants are all still there running sheep and cattle. And because elk hunting is really big business in the West. And the elk hunters and the guides and the restaurants and the motels that cater to those out-of-town hunters, they knew that wolves eat a lot of elk, and they knew that their livelihoods would be in danger if they came back. So I decided as a journalist that it was a rich story and it was something that I wanted to write about. It was a story of a cultural clash between sort of an old way of life in the West that centered around things like logging and ranching and resource extraction, and this new sort of attitude about the world that we live in and our relationship to it that emphasized things like whole ecosystems and leaving timber where it is so that it can provide habitat for other species, and that celebrated predators rather than viewing them as a threat. It wasn't until I got out there and started doing interviews for the book that I realized how rich the story really was. One of the first people that I met was a retired school teacher from San Diego. Her name was Lori Lyman. She was part of this subculture of die-hard wolf aficionados that exists in the park. Thousands of people saw 06 just for a glimpse or an hour during the time that they would come through the park. She became one of the park's main attractions. But there was also this small group of people like Lori who were absolutely obsessed with the park's wolves, would come to the park every day, would track them through these radio collars. At least one wolf in every pack in Yellowstone has a radio collar, and that allows them to be located. And then get them in their spotting scopes, these powerful telescopes where you can watch wolves from a mile or two away, and watch them all day long. And in Lori's case, take notes. Shortly after I met her, she gave me this treasure trove of material. 2,400 pages of daily observations of 06 and her pack. Essentially the diary of a wolf pack. I had no idea it existed. Even when I got this contract from Crown, I had no idea it existed. But when I did, I realized, reading through it, reading about these amazing scenes of wolf behavior. Lori was there when 06 as a lone wolf met the wolf that would eventually become her mate. She was there when 06 outwitted and later outfought the alpha female of the neighboring pack so that she could take over her territory as her own. She watched 06 defend the den from grizzlies. She watched her take elk down single-handedly. She watched her engage in this running battle that went on for almost a year with a neighboring pack. Amazing scenes of behavior. And I realized as an author what you could do with that material is you could write a nonfiction book that reads like a novel in which the main characters are wolves. Like a Jack London story, except all of it is true. And the other reason I realized the story was so rich on that very first reporting visit is that I met the man who shot 06. It was about a year after the incident. His name had never been in the papers. To give you an idea of how sensitive the issue is in Wyoming, it's against the law for a state official in Wyoming to reveal the name or even the location of a person who shot a wolf or where that event happened, to protect their privacy because it had become such a contentious issue. And so he had never given an interview. If he had, he probably would have become, the next Minnesota dentist who shot Cecil the lion. But after a year, he had changed his mind, and he was ready to tell his story. And just by coincidence, it was just luck, which I admit has a lot to do with good reporting and good journalism. I ran into him right after he had watched this documentary about 06 that I think was on the Nat Geo channel. And the book doesn't mention politics at all. It virtually has no people in it whatsoever. But at the very end, there's this stock photography image of a rifle, a hunter holding a rifle, and there's this ominous voiceover, and her life was ended by a hunter's bullet. And something about that just got to him. He said, I am not a stock photography image. I am a person, and I have a story to tell. And to my great delight, he was willing to tell it to me, provided that I didn't use his name, and I gave him a pseudonym in the book, Stephen Turnbull. And so I had his perspective, and I wouldn't want to do the story without his perspective. But meeting with him that day in his cabin, for him it was an unbelievably surreal experience. He shot this wolf in one of the most remote places in the lower 48 at dawn by himself one day in the winter. And he had no idea he was targeting the world's most famous wild animal. And the next day, what he had done was in the New York Times, and then it was around the world. And people he had never met had been judging him for something he did in the woods by himself. And he had a fascinating perspective. And in his own way, he was as obsessed with wildlife as someone like Lori or the wolf watchers in the park were. He had built his life around hunting elk, which is actually not that uncommon in that part of the world. People revere elk. That they talk about the elk herd like people in Texas talk about, Friday Night Lights high school football. It's something to talk about when you're at the grocery store. There's a lot of subsistence hunters up there. Everybody hunts up there. The women hunt, children hunt. The people that run the wolf project in Yellowstone, the biologists, they hunt elk as well. So I had his perspective in the book, and I had Lori's perspective in the book, and it just made for a richer story than I ever imagined it could. And it was also, I learned, there is this long intertwined history between our two species, Homo sapiens and Canis lupus, that I personally was never aware of. That goes back all the way, to the beginning of recorded history. Wolves have been demonized in Western culture ever since the very first sort of livestock-oriented civilizations or cultures arose, because wolves were the obstacle that had to be overcome if you wanted to raise livestock almost anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. And wolves were once the most widely distributed land mammal on the planet, found almost everywhere in the Northern Hemisphere outside of Africa. And today, Homo sapiens is the most widely distributed land mammal, and it's no coincidence. One way of looking at the last, say, 500 years of our history is as a battle between these two species to see which one would control the planet's resources, which one would control the land, and which one would be consigned sort of to the margins of civilization. And I think we know the answer to that question. But in recent years, some of us, some members of our species have switched sides and begun advocating on behalf of the wolf, and that included the federal government, which it was a federal government program that brought the wolf back to Wyoming. As I say, it was immensely controversial, and it led to this ongoing political struggle, this ongoing battle in courtrooms, all the way up to the back halls in Washington, where backroom deals were made in the Senate to take the wolf finally off the endangered species list. And so the book really follows those two parallel tracks. It's the life of 06, this amazing adventure story that is her life, and then it's this political battle going on in state capitals in the Northern Rockies and in Washington. These two tracks sort of converge at the end, and you get to see sort of in real time what the effect of those policy decisions has on a real wolf and a real wolf's family. And I hope the takeaway from the book is, if the reason I wanted the book to tell a story, to be a narrative work of nonfiction is two reasons. One, because I hope it will help people get to the end of the book, which is, a story is always a good thing for that. And two, because the story really is part of the message of the book. Because if every wolf's life is this amazing adventure story, and 06 was not unusual. What was unusual is that we knew so many details about her story, but the actual outlines of her life were very common. Any wolf would have a story like this if you only knew, or someone had been there to observe. But if every wolf's life is like this, then what is the value of one wolf's life? And what gets lost when any one story like that ends? And I know that if you are, for example, a wildlife manager in a place like Wyoming, and the calculation that you make every year is, how many wolves can we afford to lose to hunters? How many wolves can we cull on behalf of livestock before the federal government steps back in and puts the wolf back on the endangered species list? And the answer is always in the hundreds. But I hope by framing the story this way, it will ask a different question, which is, what is the value of any one wolf's life? And I hope that if this reaches a wide enough audience, it will cause some of those managers and some of those people who are in those decision-making, those positions of power, to reevaluate the way they think about wolves and the way they think about our relationship with the wild world in general. Thank you so much.